Emma and Daniel Hart walked into the grand ballroom, their hands linked, their smiles perfectly matched. To everyone watching, they looked like the kind of couple people admired, successful, confident, and completely in love. The room sparkled with chandeliers and soft golden lights, and the quiet sound of a string quartet floated through the air. Waiters moved smoothly between tables, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that looked too perfect to eat. It was the annual company dinner, a night when business and glamour met under one glittering roof. Daniel loved evenings like this. He thrived in rooms filled with people who knew his name or wanted to. He shook hands with clients, greeted partners with cheerful pats on the back, and introduced Emma proudly, but always as an accessory to his success. He had a certain charm that drew attention, a natural way of talking that made people laugh and feel important. He wore that charm like a suit. Emma, on the other hand, was different. She didn't like the noise of bragging voices or the way people seemed to compete with each other even while smiling. She stood with quiet grace, offering polite nods and warm smiles, but she didn't need to be the loudest in the room. She liked to listen, really listen, and that made her stand out in her own way. "Emma, you look stunning tonight," said one of the guests, a woman in a glittering silver dress. "You two make such a beautiful pair." "Thank you," Emma said kindly, her voice calm and sincere. Daniel laughed and added, "Well, I had to convince her to dress up. She's all work and no play, this one." People laughed politely and Emma smiled again, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She had long learned that Daniel's humor sometimes came with a little edge. It wasn't cruel, but it was careless, the kind of teasing that made him look clever and left her feeling small. They moved to their table where several important investors were seated. Daniel immediately took charge of the conversation, talking about company projects, growth, and his vision for the future. His voice filled the space easily, smooth and confident. Emma listened quietly, occasionally adding a gentle comment when someone asked for her opinion. She never interrupted, never pushed. But when she spoke, people paid attention. Her words were thoughtful, measured. She didn't talk to impress, she talked to contribute. And yet, Daniel often brushed off her insights with a light laugh or a quick change of topic. It was as if he didn't see how people's eyes shifted toward her when she spoke, or how her calm confidence carried more weight than his charm ever could. The dinner courses arrived: roasted lamb, truffle potatoes, and small plates of delicate desserts. Emma watched Daniel talk about his plans for the company, even though she knew half of those plans were built on foundations she had quietly helped create. Years ago, when the business was just starting to grow, she had believed in it, and invested in it. Not because of Daniel, but because she had seen its potential long before he did. But she never mentioned it. She didn't need to. As the night went on, Daniel grew more animated. He enjoyed the attention, the laughter, the sound of his own stories. Every now and then he would turn to Emma for a comment, but not to truly involve her, only to make himself look like the generous, confident husband who liked to include his wife. "She's the calm to my storm," he said once, smiling broadly. "Though sometimes she needs a push to keep up with me." There were chuckles around the table. Emma smiled softly, her fingers tightening just a little around her glass. A man sitting beside her leaned closer and said quietly, "I think he underestimates you." Emma turned to him and smiled. "Most people do," she said simply. Her answer was so gentle that he almost missed the meaning in it. But behind her calm there was strength, quiet, steady strength that didn't need to be shown off. Across the table, Daniel raised another toast, his voice booming with excitement. "To success," he said, lifting his glass. "To the company that keeps growing and to the people who make it happen." Glasses clinked, smiles flashed, and laughter echoed around them. Daniel looked proud, standing tall, unaware that beneath all the glamour, something about the night was quietly shifting. As the music changed to a slower tune, Emma glanced around the room. She saw faces she had known for years, investors who had once doubted her, colleagues who respected her judgment, and partners who had seen her hand in the company's growth. Yet Daniel never seemed to notice any of that. He only saw what he wanted to see, his own reflection in everyone's admiration. For a moment, Emma felt a pang of sadness. Not anger, not pride, just sadness. She had built so much, not for glory but for stability, for future security. And the man standing beside her, the one who took credit so easily, didn't even realize she owned more of that company than anyone else in the room. Daniel put an arm around her shoulder, smiling for a passing photographer. "Smile, love," he whispered. "You're the lucky one tonight." Emma looked at him, her eyes calm, her lips curving into a small, graceful smile. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe I am." The flash of the camera captured the moment, Daniel, full of confidence, and Emma, poised and serene. To the world, they looked like the perfect couple shining in the golden light of success. But inside, Emma knew the truth. And as the night went on, that truth stayed quietly in her heart, waiting, patient, steady, and sure. The dinner continued with speeches and laughter, but Emma felt detached, almost like a quiet observer watching a play she already knew the ending to. People saw Daniel's charm, but she saw his blind spots. They saw his confidence, but she saw his carelessness. And through it all, she remained composed. Because Emma understood something Daniel never did. Real power doesn't need to be loud. It can sit in silence, smile politely, and wait for the right moment to be seen. The golden lights reflected softly in her eyes as she took another sip of her wine. Around her, the party glowed with celebration. Daniel laughed somewhere across the room, his voice rising above the crowd. Emma just watched, calm and patient. The night was long, but she wasn't in a hurry. Some truths she knew didn't need to be spoken. They revealed themselves, in time. The sound of laughter filled the long dining hall, bouncing off the marble walls and chandeliers. Everyone at the table looked at Daniel as he told another story about the company's success. His voice carried easily, confident and cheerful, and the guests seemed to hang on his every word. Emma sat quietly beside him, her posture perfect, her hands resting lightly on the tablecloth. She smiled when people looked at her, nodding politely, but her mind was somewhere else, not far, just quiet, behind her calm expression. The conversation moved from new projects to company leadership. One of the guests, a senior investor with a kind face, turned to Emma and asked, "And what do you think about the company's direction, Mrs. Hart? You must have a strong opinion after all these years." Before she could answer, Daniel laughed. "Oh, Emma? She's just here to make me look good," he said with an amused grin. "She doesn't really get into the boring details." The table chuckled. It was the kind of laughter people gave when they weren't sure if a joke was meant kindly or not. Emma smiled, soft and small as she always did when Daniel said something like that. But inside, her heart pinched, not in anger, just in quiet hurt. She could feel the warmth rise in her cheeks. She didn't look down, she kept her expression gentle, controlled. Years of practice had taught her that silence could be more powerful than reaction. One woman at the table, seated across from her, shifted uncomfortably and gave Emma a sympathetic glance. Emma caught it and returned a calm smile, the kind that said, "It's all right. I'm fine." Daniel kept talking, spinning another story about a deal he had supposedly saved. "It was a close call," he said proudly, "but I managed to pull it through at the last minute." Emma was nervous, "Weren't you, dear?" Emma looked at him and nodded slightly. "Yes," she said quietly, "but I knew you'd handle it." Everyone laughed again, and Daniel gave her an approving pat on the hand. "See? Always my biggest fan," he said. Inside, Emma sighed. She remembered that deal. She was the one who had connected the two parties that made it possible. She had done it quietly with a few phone calls and a few words at the right time. But Daniel had taken the spotlight and she had let him. It wasn't worth the fight. A waiter arrived with another bottle of wine, pouring glasses with care. Daniel leaned back in his chair, glowing under the attention. He was in his element, charming, confident, admired. He didn't notice the subtle shift in the table's energy, the way a few people were now watching Emma more closely, wondering what she really thought. One of the younger executives spoke up, smiling politely. "Mrs. Hart, I've always wondered what it's like to be married to someone so deeply involved in the business. Do you two talk about work at home?" Daniel answered before she could speak. "Oh, she tries," he said with a laugh. "But honestly, I think she prefers shopping to spreadsheets." The laughter was louder this time. Emma felt it like a soft slap, unexpected but familiar. She kept her smile steady, though her heart beat faster. It wasn't humiliation that she felt, it was disappointment. He had said things like this before, small jabs dressed as jokes, but doing it here, in front of colleagues and investors, was different. It felt careless. She turned to him and said gently, "I actually enjoy numbers. They tell clearer stories than words do." The table grew quiet for a moment. A few people smiled, a few glanced at each other. Daniel chuckled awkwardly. "You see? Always the serious one," he said, brushing it off. Emma's lips curved faintly. She didn't argue. There was no need. The truth didn't need defending tonight. It was patient, it could wait. Dinner continued, plates changed, and conversation drifted. Daniel moved on to lighter topics, telling funny stories from his early days in the company. People laughed again and the earlier moment faded. But Emma noticed how one or two investors now looked at her differently, with a quiet sort of respect. She kept her eyes calm, her tone polite. Every word she spoke was chosen carefully, like stepping stones across a stream. She didn't want to embarrass him, she never did. But she also wasn't going to disappear in his shadow. A man sitting beside her, an older investor named Mr. Collins, leaned toward her slightly. "He's lucky to have you," he said quietly. "Not every man has someone so patient beside him." Emma smiled softly. "Thank you," she replied. "Patience is sometimes more useful than talent." Mr. Collins chuckled. "Wise words," he said, taking another sip of his wine. Across the table, Daniel caught her eye and smiled, unaware of the small exchange. He looked proud of himself, confident that he was the star of the evening. Emma looked back and smiled too, a real smile this time, though not for the reason he thought. The band started playing again, soft and slow. The sound of clinking glasses and gentle laughter filled the room. Emma's gaze drifted across the table to the people who ran the company with her, people who respected her judgment even if they didn't say it out loud. She had earned her place quietly, steadily, and without needing applause. She looked at Daniel again. He was laughing with two of the partners, his hands moving as he told another story, probably one that made him sound clever and bold. She watched him, not with anger but with understanding. He liked to feel important, it gave him confidence and maybe even made him feel safe. But one day she thought he would have to learn that importance isn't something you take from others, it's something you build with them. As dessert was served, a light chocolate mousse with gold flakes, Daniel leaned close and whispered, "You're awfully quiet tonight." Emma turned her head slightly toward him and said softly, "Just listening." He smiled and kissed her hand lightly. "That's my Emma," he said. "Always calm even when surrounded by chaos." She smiled back, but there was a depth in her eyes that he didn't see. Behind the calm was strength, quiet, sure, and waiting. The night went on, laughter echoing, glasses clinking, stories flowing freely. To everyone else, it looked like another perfect evening between a successful man and his elegant wife. But beneath the surface something had shifted, just slightly, just enough. Emma didn't need to say anything. She knew the truth would speak for itself soon enough. She only had to wait. And so she sat there, the picture of grace, smiling gently while Daniel laughed beside her. The world saw a charming man and his beautiful wife. But Emma knew the balance of power was already beginning to change, quietly, invisibly, inevitably. The night after the dinner, Emma sat alone in her study. The lights were soft, the house quiet. She could still hear the faint echo of laughter from the night before, Daniel's voice rising proudly as he told stories, the sound of glasses clinking, the polite applause from the crowd. It was supposed to be a celebration, but to her, it had been something else. It was a reminder of how easily people saw only what they wanted to see. On her desk lay a small folder worn at the edges. Inside were papers that told a very different story from the one Daniel liked to share. Contracts, certificates, and investment records, all signed by her years ago. She picked up the first document and smiled faintly. It was the record of her original investment, made before Daniel had even joined the company. At that time, it had been a small firm with potential but little fame. Everyone had thought she was taking a risk. Everyone except her. She had believed in the company's vision, in its ability to grow. She had invested quietly without announcing it to anyone. Back then she hadn't cared for attention or recognition. She only wanted to build something stable, something that would last. Over time the business grew, and so did her shares. When Daniel came into her life, he admired her intelligence but never truly asked about her work. He assumed she was simply comfortable, not realizing she was the reason his company even had the comfort to stand on. As she turned another page, Emma thought of Daniel's words at the dinner. "She's just here to make me look good." She could still hear the laughter that followed. It didn't make her angry anymore. It almost made her sad, not for herself but for him. He was so sure he understood everything around him, yet he didn't know the foundation beneath his feet was one she had built. Daniel was proud of his success and in many ways he deserved it. He worked hard, he charmed people and he made things happen. But he never looked closely at how things worked behind the scenes. He never cared to read the fine print, never checked who held what shares, who really owned what. He only saw the surface, and the surface told him he was in control. Emma leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She didn't like the idea of power for the sake of power. For her, it had always been about stability, making sure that if things went wrong, there would be something solid to hold on to. Over the years, that quiet stability had grown into something bigger, something even she hadn't expected. One day when she checked the numbers, she realized she now owned 56% of the company. She hadn't told anyone. Not Daniel, not even her closest friends. It wasn't a secret she meant to hide out of guilt, it was simply not something she thought needed to be discussed. The company had always been like a shared dream between her and Daniel, though they had played different roles in it. He was the public face, the one who shined in meetings and interviews. She was the silent force, watching over decisions, guiding the structure, and ensuring it grew strong roots. But as she thought back to the dinner, she began to see that silence had its limits. When people laughed at her, thinking she was just the quiet wife who came along for show, something in her shifted. It wasn't pride that stirred in her chest, it was realization. She had given him space to lead, to feel powerful, but in doing so, she had let him forget who she truly was. She stood up and walked to the window. The city lights sparkled below, tall buildings glowing in the distance. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably still talking about the dinner, about how well everything went. She smiled faintly, thinking how strange it was that one person could be so close and yet so unaware. Downstairs, she heard the door open and close. Daniel's voice echoed through the hallway. "Emma? You still awake?" "Yes," she called softly. He entered the study, smiling, loosening his tie. "You're working again?" "It's late." "Just looking over a few things," she said calmly. He laughed lightly. "You and your papers. Always so serious. You should leave the business stuff to the people who enjoy it." Emma smiled. "You mean like you?" "Exactly," he said proudly. "You know I was born for this." She turned back to her desk, closing the folder gently. "Yes," she said, her tone soft. "You do love being in charge." Daniel didn't notice the quiet meaning behind her words. He kissed her on the cheek and said, "You keep me balanced. That's what matters." As he left the room, Emma looked down at the folder again. The signature at the bottom of the last page gleamed faintly under the light, her name written clearly in ink. She traced the letters with her finger, her expression thoughtful. She had never needed to use her ownership as leverage. But knowing she had it gave her a quiet strength. It reminded her that she didn't need anyone's permission to belong at the table. She already owned the table. The next morning she went to the office early. The air was crisp and sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the building's lobby. Employees greeted her politely, though many didn't realize who she really was. To them she was Mr. Hart's wife. She smiled at the thought, it didn't bother her anymore. That label was temporary. She entered the conference room where a few board members were already seated. They were preparing for a major meeting about a potential merger. Daniel wasn't there yet. The room buzzed with quiet conversation until one of the executives noticed her and smiled warmly. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "it's an honor to have you here." "The honor is mine," Emma said. The meeting began and she listened quietly, taking notes. When Daniel finally arrived, he seemed surprised to see her but didn't comment. He took the lead, speaking with his usual confidence. But when a financial question arose, one that required knowledge of shareholder structure, Daniel hesitated. He glanced at the paper in front of him, then looked up, unsure. Emma spoke softly, her tone even. "The voting power would remain stable," she said, "as long as the controlling shares are maintained. Which, at the moment, they are." Everyone nodded in agreement. Daniel looked at her, a little surprised. He didn't ask how she knew that. After the meeting, as people left, one of the executives stopped by her side. "You have a sharp understanding of the company," he said. "You must have been involved for a long time." Emma smiled. "Longer than most," she said quietly. Later that night, she stood again in her study thinking of the day. Daniel still had no idea. No idea that the company he loved to boast about was one she had helped build and quietly controlled. She didn't plan to humiliate him or take away his pride. She didn't want revenge. She simply wanted balance, the kind that comes when truth finally takes its place. She looked at the papers one last time, then slipped them back into the drawer. She didn't need to prove anything tonight. There would be a time when he would understand. And when that time came, she wouldn't need to raise her voice or say, "I told you so." She would only smile, calm, composed, and certain. Because power, she knew, was not about who spoke the loudest. It was about who held the foundation steady when no one else noticed. The next evening, the ballroom glowed again, filled with soft golden lights and laughter. It was the second night of the company's annual celebration, an event where the biggest investors, board members, and executives gathered to honor success and growth. The air smelled of expensive perfume and polished ambition. Emma walked in beside Daniel, calm as always, her dress a quiet shade of silver that shimmered under the lights. Daniel was all smiles, waving to colleagues and shaking hands. He loved these moments, when all eyes were on him. "Tonight's the big one," he whispered proudly as they entered. "The CEO is announcing the expansion project." Everyone will remember this night. Emma smiled. I'm sure they will, she said softly. They took their seats at the long glass table near the front. Around them, voices rose in cheerful conversation. Waiters poured champagne and placed delicate plates of food before the guests. The music from the grand piano in the corner blended smoothly with the hum of laughter. Daniel leaned back, clearly in his element. Every so often he whispered jokes to the man sitting next to him, earning bursts of laughter. Emma stayed quiet, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was used to these gatherings, to the rhythm of speeches, applause and polite praise. But tonight she felt a small, still certainty deep inside her. Something was different this time. Something that had been waiting quietly was about to come into the light. When dessert was finished, the CEO stood up. He was an older man, respected and calm, his voice steady as he began to speak. The room quieted immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this has been an incredible year for our company. Our growth, our expansion and our success, all of it has been possible because of teamwork and trust. And tonight, before we move forward with new announcements, I would like to take a moment to honor someone very important. Daniel leaned forward, his smile widening. Emma could almost see the thought forming in his mind. He expected the recognition. She could tell by the way he straightened his jacket, ready to stand if his name was called. The CEO continued, his tone warm and respectful. Behind every success story, there are people whose efforts often go unseen. Some work quietly away from the spotlight, but their impact is enormous. Daniel gave a modest laugh, glancing at Emma as if to say, here it comes. The CEO smiled. Tonight, we want to recognize the person who believed in this company from the very beginning, the one who gave it the strength and foundation to grow into what it is today. He lifted his glass slightly. To our majority shareholder, Mrs. Emma Hart. The room went completely silent. For a long moment, all that could be heard was the soft clink of a glass being set down somewhere at the far end of the table. Daniel froze, his smile vanishing. His eyes turned slowly toward Emma, confusion flashing across his face, then disbelief. Emma met his gaze with calm, steady eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't look proud or smug, just composed. She reached for her champagne glass and lifted it gracefully. Thank you, she said softly, her voice even but clear enough for the whole room to hear. Respect, she added, pausing for a heartbeat, is the finest investment. The guests, uncertain at first, began to clap. The sound grew louder, filling the silence that had fallen after her words. The CEO smiled approvingly, and several of the board members nodded in agreement. Emma's calm smile never wavered. Daniel's hands were still resting on the table, stiff and unmoving. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had just heard. Majority shareholder? His wife. He looked at her again, but her expression gave nothing away. She sat tall, her chin slightly lifted, her face serene. The applause grew stronger. Someone called out, to Mrs. Hart, and glasses were raised around the room. Emma inclined her head politely, her silver earrings catching the light. Daniel forced himself to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He could feel a faint heat rising in his chest, a mix of shock, embarrassment and something deeper, a quiet realization that he had never really known the full truth. After the toast, people began to come up to Emma, offering congratulations and words of admiration. You've been such a guiding force for the company, one of the directors said warmly. We always knew there was wisdom behind the scenes. Thank you, Emma replied, her voice gentle. I've always believed in the company's vision, and in the people who make it grow. Daniel stood beside her, smiling mechanically as more guests joined the conversation. Every compliment directed at Emma felt like a small reminder of everything he had ignored. He remembered all the times he had brushed off her thoughts, all the moments he had turned her into the quiet figure behind his own stage. Now the stage had turned toward her, and she hadn't even asked for it. When the crowd thinned, Daniel finally found a quiet moment beside her. He leaned in and whispered, his voice low, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Emma turned her head toward him. Her eyes were soft but steady. "You never asked," she said simply. He blinked, unsure what to say. I didn't think." "No," she said kindly, finishing his thought, "you didn't think you needed to." He stared at her for a long moment, unable to respond. She wasn't angry. There was no spite in her tone, no sharp edge. That made it harder, the calm truth of it. The CEO called Daniel over for a handshake and he went, still dazed. Emma watched him walk away, surrounded by laughter and polite conversation, and she felt a quiet peace settle in her chest. She hadn't wanted to embarrass him, that had never been her goal. But perhaps it was time for him to see that silence did not mean weakness, and gentleness did not mean lack of power. Later in the evening, as people began to leave, the CEO approached Emma once more. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "I wasn't sure how he'd react." Emma smiled faintly. "Neither was I," she said. "But sometimes truth reveals itself at the right time." He nodded. "You've built something remarkable, Mrs. Hart." "I just believed in it," she replied. "That's all." When she and Daniel stepped outside, the night air was cool. The city glowed quietly beneath the stars. Daniel didn't speak for a while. Finally he said, "All this time, I thought I was the one holding everything together." Emma looked at him, her face calm, her eyes thoughtful. "You did hold it together," she said gently. "Just not alone." He looked away, his pride softening into something more human. "I should have seen it," he said quietly. "Perhaps," she said, "but sometimes people see only what they want to. That's human." They stood there for a moment, the cool wind brushing past them. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, not as the quiet wife beside him, but as the woman who had stood behind the company's success all along. She smiled faintly, and in her eyes there was no triumph, only grace. They walked to their car in silence. Daniel held the door open for her this time, a small, unspoken gesture of respect. As the car pulled away from the glowing hotel, Emma turned to look out the window. The city lights reflected softly against the glass, and she felt a quiet sense of closure. For years she had stood in the background, content to let others speak. Tonight, without raising her voice or demanding attention, she had finally been seen for who she truly was. And that, she thought, was enough. When the evening finally ended, the sound of quiet whispers followed Emma and Daniel out of the ballroom. The night that had begun with laughter and pride had closed with a silence that said more than words ever could. Guests lingered in small groups, their voices low, their glances curious. Everyone had seen what had happened. The toast, the reveal, the calm way Emma had lifted her glass while Daniel sat frozen in disbelief. Daniel could still feel the weight of that moment pressing on his chest. Every handshake, every polite smile from the guests after the toast had felt different. He had been used to being the man everyone admired, the one who filled a room with charm. But now it was Emma they had looked at with respect. Her quiet grace had spoken louder than all his words. As they stepped outside, the cold night air brushed against them. The sound of distant city traffic hummed in the background. Emma walked ahead of him, her steps slow and steady, her silver dress moving softly in the breeze. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. There was no anger in her, no need to gloat. She was simply done with the noise. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his thoughts tangled. He wanted to say something, anything to fill the silence between them, but nothing felt right. Every word he thought of sounded small compared to what had just happened. He had mocked her, laughed at her, treated her like an ornament at his side, and all along she had been the one holding the true power. Not the kind that shouts or demands, but the kind that stands quietly, steady and unshaken. They reached their car. The driver opened the door, and Daniel motioned for Emma to go in first. She nodded politely, as if it were just another ordinary evening. Inside, the air was still. The city lights moved across her face as the car drove away from the hotel. Daniel finally spoke. "Emma," he said quietly, "why didn't you tell me?" She looked out the window, her expression unreadable. "Would you have listened?" He hesitated. The truth was heavy between them. I don't know," he admitted. She turned her head slightly, her eyes calm. "I don't think you would have. You were too busy trying to be seen to notice what was already around you." He sighed and leaned back, staring at the roof of the car. "I didn't mean to make you feel small." "You didn't make me feel small," she said gently. "You made yourself look small." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was simply honest, soft but steady like everything else about her. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw more than the quiet woman who smiled at his jokes. He saw the woman who had believed in the company before anyone else did, the woman who had worked behind the scenes, who never asked for recognition but still carried the weight of it all. He had spent years thinking he was the one leading when all along she had been the one guiding. When they reached home, Emma got out first. The house was dark and peaceful, the kind of silence that usually felt comfortable. Tonight, though, it carried a strange tension. Daniel followed her inside, watching as she removed her earrings and placed them on the dresser. She moved with the same calm she had shown all night, like someone who had finally laid down a burden she had carried for too long. "Emma," he said again, his voice low, "I don't know how to fix this." She turned to him, her eyes soft. "You don't have to fix anything," she said. "You just have to learn." Learn what? He asked quietly. That respect isn't about who talks louder, she replied. It's about who listens, who understands, and who stands beside others, not above them. Daniel nodded slowly, the truth settling deep in him. He had always thought success was about control, about being the one in charge, the one people looked up to. But tonight he had seen something different. True strength, he realized, was not about taking the spotlight. It was about holding steady when others lose their way. Emma walked to the window and looked out at the quiet city. You know, she said softly, I never wanted to embarrass you. I never wanted you to feel small. But I also couldn't let you keep thinking the world revolved around your reflection. He took a deep breath. I deserved it, he admitted. She turned to face him again, a faint smile touching her lips. No, she said. You didn't deserve to be hurt. But maybe you needed to be reminded. Daniel looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. Reminded of what? That respect, she said, repeating the words she'd spoken at the dinner, is the finest investment. The room was quiet for a long time. Daniel stood there, staring at the floor, while Emma walked past him gently, heading toward the stairs. Each step she took felt like a closing chapter, not in anger but in calm acceptance. When she reached the top of the stairs, she turned back and said, You don't have to prove yourself to me anymore. Just be better. He nodded. I will, he said quietly. I want to be. She gave him a small, genuine smile, the kind she hadn't shown in a long time. Then she disappeared down the hallway, her soft footsteps fading into silence. Daniel stood alone in the living room for a long time after that. The house felt larger, emptier somehow. He walked to the dining table and sat down, his thoughts heavy. He thought about every joke he had made at her expense, every time he had cut her off, every time he had spoken for her when she could have spoken for herself. He thought about how proud she had looked when she raised her glass, not with arrogance but with quiet dignity. He realized then that respect wasn't something she had demanded, it was something she had earned long ago. He was only now beginning to see it. The next morning, Daniel woke up early. Emma was already in the garden, trimming a few flowers. She looked peaceful, her hair tied back, sunlight brushing across her face. He watched her for a moment before walking outside. Good morning, he said softly. She smiled without looking up. Good morning. He hesitated. I was thinking, he said, maybe we could start over, not as husband and wife trying to outshine each other but as partners. Real ones. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for a moment. That depends, she said gently. Have you learned the lesson? He nodded. I think I have. And if I forget it, I hope you'll remind me. Emma smiled. I don't think I'll need to, she said. If you've really learned, you'll remember on your own. The air was quiet between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. Daniel picked up a watering can and began helping her with the plants. It was a small thing, but it felt right. Two people working side by side, finally balanced. As the sun rose higher, Emma looked up at the sky and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, contentment. She didn't need to prove her worth anymore. The truth had already spoken for her. And Daniel, standing beside her, finally understood that respect wasn't given to those who demanded it. It was given to those who earned it through grace, patience, and quiet strength. That night, as they sat together watching the city lights, Daniel reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was peaceful. He looked at her and said softly, You were right. She smiled, her eyes warm. I usually am, she said with gentle humor. And this time Daniel laughed, not to impress anyone, not to cover discomfort, but because he truly felt lighter. For him, the lesson had been hard. For her, it had been long. But for both of them, it was exactly what they needed.